I would like to be anecdotal and relate to you something from my own experience of trying to work for peace and a peaceful resolution to some of the complex problems of our age, in particular, the problem of hostage-taking. Hostage-taking which is symptomatic of much deeper disorders. There are two types, roughly speaking, of hostage-taking. On the one hand, there is hostage-taking which might be described as being political, and that is where an individual or individuals are taken and are held against the achievement of a political goal that is the desire of the group that's holding them. There is another type of hostage-taking which would go under the heading of criminal, and that is where hostages are taken by criminal gangs for ransom. And that second type of hostage-taking, of course, was seen particularly in a form of piracy in Somalia in recent years. They were symptomatic, of course, both these areas are symptomatic of deeper disorders. In Somalia, the total breakdown of law and order, the breakdown of the economy, and so on. In other situations, different reasons. Both, of course, these types of hostage-taking are in fact criminal acts, but they're divided in that particular way because a different way and style of negotiating is required to deal with one and to deal with the other. My own experience in this field goes back very many years to the time I lived in Uganda when General Amin came to power. Many of my colleagues were taken, thrown into prison camps, and murdered. And I was, in those days, I'm a layman, but I've worked for most of my life from a church base. I was an advisor to the first African Archbishop of Uganda, one by the name of Waite CBE. It was because of my association with him and with the church, and this underlines Michael's point, that I was able to get access to Amin and was able to have some degree of success with a few people. In other words, success being interpreted as being enabled to obtain their freedom. Regrettably, many people died, were murdered. And Waite CBE's successor, one by the name of Janani Lawum, a good friend of mine, whom I knew very well, was a man who stood fearlessly for that which was just and true and right. And Janani was murdered. He's a name that ought to be more widely recognized around the world as being one of the great African leaders. I moved along to work in many different conflict situations around the world, was then recruited by Robert Runcie to be his advisor on ecclesiastical and diplomatic matters around the world concerning the Anglican Communion. And of course, in that role, problems came to my desk concerning hostage-taking around the world. And it was because, again, of my association with the church and with the Archbishop of Canterbury that one was able to get access to people such as Gaddafi, with whom I negotiated directly, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with Revolutionary Guards in Iran, and with Gaddafi in Libya. It was possible to have that degree of access because of my association with the Archbishop and association with the Church, again underlining Michael's point. In this particular field, my style of negotiating has been as follows, and I think it is worth mentioning these points because they are points that need to be followed when we are working in a broader context away from the rather narrow confine of hostage negotiation. First of all, seek a face-to-face meeting with hostage takers. Now that is full of risk because you're seeking to meet with people who are highly volatile, who would in fact possibly kidnap you or kill you. And one has to be prepared in that extreme situation to take that risk. You measure it, and then you are prepared for things to go wrong. And if you're not prepared to face what might be the worst, then one should not enter that field. Of course, the prior question to ask is, how do you obtain that degree of access? That is another question altogether. Secondly, if you can get that access, then try and build a relationship of trust. To try and build up some degree of rapport. Not impossible, but difficult. Difficult because one is often dealing with people who belong to a different cultural background, a different religious background, different ethnic background, and so on. It is not impossible. Thirdly, if you can achieve that, then to move to the area of asking the question, why? And this is a question that is so vitally important. Why are you behaving as you're behaving? What are the reasons for that? To try and get that degree of understanding. If you can get to that point, then, and again I'm speaking of political cases, not of criminal cases, if you can get to that point, then you can begin to talk about some form of resolution, hopefully. Now, I want to give you an anecdotal account which will illustrate those points and the importance of those points. This is one story. It's not applicable in every situation, but it is one story absolutely as it happened. At the time of the Iranian Revolution, a number of church people disappeared. John and Audrey Coleman John was a doctor in Iran. He disappeared along with his wife. Jean Waddell was secretary to the bishop in Iran. One evening, she opened the door to her apartment and was shot and left for dead. Had not her neighbor been a medical practitioner, she would have died. She was taken to the hospital. She made a recovery of sorts, and when she had recovered, she was immediately seized again and thrown into the Evin prison. A number of leading clergy, Iranians, disappeared. No one knew what had happened to them. Now, the families of the British hostages came to Lambeth Palace, which is the residence of and office of the Archbishop of Canterbury in London, and where I have my office. And they said that they were getting no information at all as to what had happened. In those days, the British Foreign Office was not particularly good at keeping in touch with families. They've improved enormously in recent years. And some years ago, I founded an organization called Hostage UK, which gives support to hostage families and also does other work in that field. And we have a very close but independent relationship with the Foreign Office. They have improved dramatically. But in those days, they didn't see that they had a prime pastoral responsibility to the families who'd been affected. So they came to Lambeth Palace and asked for help. I discussed this with the Archbishop and decided that I would get out there and see what, if anything, could be done. Iran was in turmoil. The revolution was in full swing. There were the huge banners across the airport as you went into the airport, indicating death to the states, death to UK, and so on. I went to my hotel, and the little church there, the small cathedral in Tehran, of course, had not had any services at all for a long time, because naturally people were afraid, and afraid of what would happen to them. It was Christmas time, and I decided that I would ring the numbers of people I knew who were out there and ask them to join me in the cathedral for a small carol service, simply to get them together. And I knew as I made that call that there would be possibly other people listening to the line other than those to whom I was speaking. And it might just draw a little attention to myself and bring someone out to meet with me. It did in a surprising way. I got down to the church, and to my surprise and delight, it began to fill. I brought with me a message from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and at the appropriate point in the small carol service, I stood at the lectern and gave the message. As I was delivering that message, the side door opened, and into the room walked several Revolutionary Guards. They were wearing hobnail boots, carrying Kalashnikovs, wearing BDs. They sat in the front pew, they folded their arms and stared at me. I said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "You've arrived a little late. I'll begin my address again." And so I did. It was very brief. The end of the address, a man who identified himself as a leader of the group came to me and he said, "We like what you say. We'll take you to see your people." Now, hold on a minute. How do I know that this man is genuine? How do I know that he is going to take me to see his people, as he says? How do I know he's not going to kidnap me? I tried to play for time and said, "Look, can you let me go to the hotel and collect some cards I have for the people?" He said, "No, you come now or not at all." Now here one had to go on one thing alone, and that was intuition. Intuition can be, very often, very right, very accurate. But there are times, of course, when intuition can be wildly off the mark. And if we use intuition, it really ought always to be aligned with some other measure. There was no other measure possible at that point. My intuition said, "Trust that man." And I did. I said, "All right, I come with you." He called for another member of the group to join us, and a man got up from the back of the church, was blindfolded, and the two of us went out to a car and drove off into the night. It was raining, I remember it now distinctly. There were Revolutionary Guards on street corners standing around bonfires. The embassy of the American embassy and the British embassy were ablaze with light as they were being ransacked. We went to what I believe, and was told later, was one of the Shah's summer palaces. It was full of people who were being interrogated. As you will appreciate, what often happens at a time of great social and upheaval, of revolution, is that minority groups come under suspicion and often under attack, and often are interrogated and many of them killed, as indeed many people in this particular interrogation center were in fact murdered. I was told to wait while my guide went round the back to see another prisoner whom he said they were going to execute in the morning. Whether or not he was saying that for bravado, I know not. He left me. Then he came back and said, right, follow me. We went round the back, down into a basement. A door opened, and there, to my relief, I saw sitting on the floor John Coleman, together with his wife, and some other Iranians whom I did not know. We were able to have conversation together. John had been brought together with his wife that night for the first time in months. He had no idea up to the day before whether she was alive or dead. We went away from that encounter, and I formed a relationship with that particular revolutionary guard. He took me to his home, and we sat on the floor and had a meal. And after we'd eaten, he produced the family album. He said, look, he was one of 7 brothers. He said that one had his education stopped. This one was murdered. And he went on through that family album relating the sad litany of tragedy that had affected his family across the years. He turned to me and he said, you had no concern for the abuses that took place in this country. All you were caring about was your oil wealth. And here then again he went on to make reference to Dr. Mossadegh and all that sad history. I responded by saying, but do 2 wrongs make a right? Are you going in fact to improve this situation in any way by taking innocent people? Then he came up with a classic response, which is so often given. He said, no, these people are not innocent, they're spies. A response often made in situations of that kind, where, as I said, minority groups, the Christian church being one, a minority group, where often they're seen as being subversive and against the forward, and what is perceived as a forward movement. I said, let's look into that. I said, these people are not spies. I don't believe it. He was convinced they were. What we found out was this, after painstaking investigation, that at the time of the revolution, of the upheaval, the removal of the Shah, naturally enough, this small Christian community became extremely anxious. There was one member of that community who was a convert from Islam and who was, unfortunately, somewhat mentally defective. In order to try and save his own skin, he wrote a letter to the Revolutionary Guard saying that the church was a hotbed of espionage. What did the Revolutionary Guards do? They put a watch on the church. And what did they see? On Sundays, they saw diplomats from the British Embassy go to a service there. To any observer, quite innocent if you're a member of your diplomatic mission and you have a particular belief, you will go to the church or building of your choice. To a Revolutionary Guard who's been fueled with that suspicion, that was enough to say, round them up, round up the leaders, and subject them to interrogation, which is what they did. I was able to track that down. And the poor man from the church was brought before us. He was convinced he was going to be killed. In fact, he wasn't. The Revolutionary Guard said, no, we can see his mental state. We will let him go and we will release these people to your care. I said, before you do so, will you do me a favor? Will you ring the Archbishop in Canterbury and tell him just that? He said, yes. And he picked up the phone and rang Robert Runcie in the old palace at Canterbury. They were handed over to me and we came home. That was it. What does it say? It says in that story, I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Often we are told it is impossible to negotiate. And here I completely agree with Michael, that when he said there are certain characters who are deeply psychopathic, who have committed and become so committed to that brutal way of life, you can't negotiate with them. But eventually, there will be, and there are already people with whom one can talk with. A lot of that talking will have to be done by people in the region themselves. I completely agree with Michael when he says that at this stage there have to be preventative measures deployed in order to stop this terrible outrage of brutality and murder and mayhem. And it does not help matters one iota when we have so-called civilized nation behaving as the way it behaved in Guantanamo and elsewhere. That does not help at all. But all I am saying is this, that there is room, and there always has to be room, for dialogue. And the way in which peace, at least a more peaceful situation, is achieved is by people on the ground getting together, sharing together. This is where the religions and the church leaders and the leaders of other faiths have such a vital and important role to play, because they are present at every area in the locality. They are there. And their energies need to be utilized in stretching out a hand to the other, because without that relationship at ground level, political settlements are useless. You can make them, but they will not stick at all unless people on the ground are together and dialogue is possible. I stop at that point.